I never thought I'd be the kind of person who needed to write something like this. I always figured the stories you hear about hospitals at night, strange noises, flickering lights, the sense of being watched, were just the product of tired minds and too much caffeine. I was a skeptic, the kind of person who rolled their eyes at ghost stories and urban legends. But after what happened during my night shifts at St. Augustine's, I can't dismiss those stories anymore. I can't sleep, either. Not really. Not the way I used to, when the world felt safe and explainable. I'm writing this because I need to get it out, to put it somewhere outside my own head. Maybe if I do, I'll finally be able to close my eyes without seeing that thing in the hallway, or hearing the sound it made as it moved. I started working nights at St. Augustine's Hospital about 6 months ago. I was a new nurse, fresh out of school, eager to prove myself. The pay was better on nights, and I liked the idea of quieter shifts, fewer visitors, less chaos. The hospital itself was old, a sprawling brick building with wings that had been added and renovated so many times that the floor plan made no sense. There were corridors that led nowhere, doors that had been painted shut, and entire sections that were supposedly under renovation but never seemed to change. The staff joked about the place being haunted, but I chalked it up to the usual hospital gallows humor. My first few weeks were uneventful. I learned the routines, got to know the regulars, both patients and staff. There was Mrs. Patel, who always asked for extra blankets, and Mr. Grady, who insisted the nurses were stealing his socks. The night shift crew was a tight-knit group. Maria, the charge nurse, who'd been there for 20 years, Jamal, the orderly, who could lift a patient twice his size without breaking a sweat, and Dr. Singh, who always brought in homemade samosas for the staff. We looked out for each other, shared stories, and tried to keep things light. But there was always something a little off about the hospital at night. The way the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, the way the air felt colder in certain hallways, the way the silence pressed in on you when you were alone. I started to notice things. Small things at first. Supplies going missing from locked cabinets. Call lights going off in empty rooms. The elevator stopping on floors no one had called it to. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the building settling. But the feeling of being watched never really went away. One night, about a month into my job, I was making my rounds on the 3rd floor. It was the oldest part of the hospital, mostly used for long-term patients and overflow when the ER was full. The lights were dimmer there, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of the hospital's early days. Black and white images of nurses in starched uniforms, doctors with serious faces, patients in iron lungs. I always felt uneasy on that floor, but I tried to ignore it. I was checking on Mr. Grady, who'd been complaining about chest pain. He was asleep, snoring softly, so I made a note in his chart and moved on. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard a noise, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. I turned, expecting to see Jamal or Maria, but the hallway was empty. The sound stopped. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, then shook my head and kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I turned the corner and saw a figure at the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was one of the patients. Maybe someone had gotten out of bed and was confused. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long, its posture all wrong. It stood in the shadow between two flickering lights, its face hidden. I stopped, suddenly afraid to move any closer. "Hello," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. I took a step back, my hand reaching for the call button clipped to my scrubs. The lights above the figure flickered, then went out completely, plunging that end of the hallway into darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. I told myself I was seeing things, that it was just a trick of the light and my tired brain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could and spent the rest of the shift in the nurses' station, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next night, I mentioned what I'd seen to Maria. She gave me a long, searching look, then shrugged. "You're not the first," she said quietly. We've all seen things here. Just try not to think about it too much. It's easier that way. I wanted to press her for more, but she changed the subject, and I let it go. But from that night on, I started paying closer attention. I started noticing patterns, cold spots in certain rooms, the way the security cameras would glitch at the same time every night, the way some patients would stare at the ceiling and whisper to themselves when they thought no one was listening. One night, I found Jamal standing in the supply closet, staring at the wall. He didn't seem to hear me when I called his name. When he finally turned, his eyes were wide and unfocused. "It's not supposed to be here," he whispered. "It's not supposed to be here." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked away. After that night, I started keeping a journal. Not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because I needed to keep track of what was happening. I wrote down every strange occurrence, every unexplained noise, every time I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. The entries started out short, just a few lines here and there, but soon they grew longer, more detailed, more frantic. I found myself rereading them during my breaks, searching for patterns, for some kind of logic that would make sense of what I was experiencing. The hospital itself seemed to change after dark. During the day, it was a place of order and routine, of doctors and nurses moving with purpose, of patients and visitors coming and going. But at night, it became something else. A labyrinth of empty corridors and locked doors, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, of silence so deep it felt like a living thing. The building creaked and groaned, the pipes rattled, the lights flickered. Sometimes, I would hear footsteps echoing down the hallways, but when I looked, there was never anyone there. One night, I was assigned to sit with a patient in room 317. Her name was Mrs. Callahan, and she was in the late stages of dementia. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were jumbled and confused. The staff took turns sitting with her overnight, just to make sure she didn't try to get out of bed or hurt herself. I brought a book to pass the time, but I couldn't focus. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the floor, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Mrs. Callahan stared at the ceiling, her lips moving silently. Every so often, she would glance at the corner of the room, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to comfort her, but she didn't seem to hear me. Around 3 a.m., she suddenly sat up, her eyes fixed on the doorway. "It's here," she whispered. "Don't let it in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What's here, Mrs. Callahan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. She just stared at the door, her hands clutching the blanket. I followed her gaze, half expecting to see someone standing there. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I sat with her until dawn, too afraid to leave her alone. After that, I started to notice that certain patients seemed to sense it, too. They would become agitated at night, refusing to sleep, insisting that something was in the room with them. Some would talk about a tall, dark figure standing in the corner, watching them. Others would complain about the cold, about the way the air felt wrong. The doctors chalked it up to delirium, to the side effects of medication, to the natural confusion that comes with illness and age. But I knew better. I'd seen it myself. One night, I was walking past the old surgical wing, a part of the hospital that had been closed off for years. The doors were always locked, but that night, one of them was ajar. I hesitated, then pushed it open. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign at the far end. The air was colder here, and it smelled of dust and disinfectant. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a faint whispering, like voices just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. I followed the sound to a room at the end of the hall. The door was half open, and inside, I could see the outline of an old operating table, covered in a stained sheet. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I saw a figure standing at the foot of the table. It was tall and thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes black and empty. It turned to look at me, and I felt a wave of nausea, like the ground had dropped out from under me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe. The lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. The room was empty, silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I ran back to the nurse's station, my hands shaking. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't have to. The look on my face said it all. After that, the dreams started. Every night, I would dream of the hospital, of endless hallways and locked doors, of shadows that moved just out of sight, of cold hands reaching for me in the dark. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that something was in the room with me. I started dreading my shifts, counting down the hours until dawn, until the sun would rise and the world would feel normal again. But the worst part was the sense of inevitability, the feeling that whatever was haunting the hospital was getting closer, that it was only a matter of time before it found me. I started seeing the figure more often, sometimes just a glimpse in a darkened hallway, sometimes a reflection in a window, sometimes a shadow that didn't belong. The other staff noticed it, too. Maria became withdrawn, spending more time in her office with the door closed. Jamal started calling in sick, refusing to work the third floor. Even Dr. Singh, who had always been calm and unflappable, started looking over his shoulder, jumping at every unexpected noise. One night, I found a note taped to my locker. It was written in shaky handwriting, the letters barely legible. "Don't go to the basement," it read. "It's waiting down there." I stared at the note for a long time, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out who could have left it. The handwriting didn't match anyone I knew, and no one admitted to writing it. I asked Maria, but she just shook her head and told me to throw it away. "People get weird on nights," she said, but her eyes darted away from mine, and I could tell she was lying. I kept the note in my pocket, running my thumb over the words whenever I felt that cold, crawling sensation at the back of my neck. The basement at St. Augustine's was a place everyone avoided if they could. It was where the old laundry machines were kept, along with storage rooms full of broken equipment and boxes of files no one had touched in years. The lights down there were always dim, and the air smelled of mildew and something metallic. I'd only been down there a handful of times, usually to fetch supplies or help maintenance with a stubborn fuse box. Each time, I'd felt a sense of unease, like I was being watched from the shadows. After finding the note, I started asking around about the basement. Most people just shrugged or changed the subject. But one night, while I was restocking the supply cart, I overheard two of the older nurses talking in the break room. They spoke in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid someone might be listening. "It's always the basement," one of them said. "That's where it started, you know. Back when the hospital was first built. They say something happened down there, something bad." The other nurse nodded, her face pale. "I heard it was a fire. Or maybe a patient who went missing. My aunt worked here in the 70s. She said there were places down there you just didn't go. Not if you wanted to come back." I waited until they left, then slipped into the break room and wrote down everything I could remember from their conversation. I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, but the more I learned, the less sense it made. There were too many stories, too many rumors, and none of them explained what I'd seen. A few nights later, I was finishing up my rounds when I heard a noise coming from the stairwell at the end of the hall. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone dragging something heavy down the stairs. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the linoleum, and peered around the corner. The stairwell door was open, swinging slowly on its hinges. The thumping had stopped, replaced by a faint, wet sound, like something being dragged across concrete. I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the shadows seemed to press in around me. Halfway down, I saw a smear of something dark on the wall. Too dark to be rust, too thick to be water. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the open door behind me. I fumbled for the switch, but the lights didn't come on. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The storage rooms loomed on either side, their doors hanging open, revealing stacks of broken beds and wheelchairs, boxes of old files, and piles of tangled sheets. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt heavy. I moved slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I passed one of the storage rooms, I heard a whisper, a soft, sibilant sound, like someone breathing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, echoing off the concrete walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Then I saw it, a shadow moving at the far end of the hallway, taller than any person, its limbs impossibly long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It slid along the wall, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, its eyes two pinpricks of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The thing stopped, its head snapping toward me. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, so intense it burned. The whispering grew louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, then went out, plunging me into darkness. For a moment, I was sure it was going to come for me, that I would feel those cold, inhuman hands wrap around my throat. But then the lights flickered back on, and the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty, silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my phone, and ran up the stairs, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. Maria was there, her face pale. She didn't ask what had happened. She just handed me a cup of coffee and told me to sit down. After that night, I refused to go to the basement. I made excuses, traded shifts, did whatever I could to avoid it. But the sense of dread didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The thing I'd seen in the basement started appearing in other parts of the hospital. Always at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach. The patients grew more restless, the staff more withdrawn. It was as if the hospital itself was sick, infected by something that couldn't be seen or explained. I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, felt its cold gaze on me. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, just exhaustion, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong at St. Augustine's. Something that went beyond broken lights and cold spots and missing supplies. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. I started to notice changes in the people around me, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Maria, once the backbone of the night shift, began making mistakes, forgetting to chart medications, misplacing patient files, snapping at staff for no reason. Jamal, who used to fill the halls with his booming laugh, barely spoke above a whisper. Even Dr. Singh, who had always been a calming presence, seemed distracted, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The patients were no better. Those who could speak complained of nightmares, of waking up to find someone, or something, standing at the foot of their beds. Others grew agitated, refusing to sleep, insisting that the hospital was no longer safe. One night, Mrs. Callahan, the dementia patient, began screaming, her voice echoing down the hallway. When I rushed to her room, I found her cowering in the corner, her eyes wild with terror. "It's in the walls," she sobbed. "It's hungry." I tried to comfort her, but she flinched away from my touch, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I stayed with her until she calmed down, but the fear lingered in her eyes long after her screams had faded. I wrote it off as another symptom of her illness, but the truth was, I was just as scared as she was. The hospital administration tried to keep things running as usual, but the cracks were starting to show. Maintenance was called in almost every night to fix flickering lights, malfunctioning elevators, and unexplained power outages. Security reported seeing unauthorized people in restricted areas, but every time they checked the cameras, the footage was blank, just static and shadows. Rumors spread among the staff, stories of things seen and heard in the dead of night. Some people quit, others transferred to day shifts, but most of us stayed, bound by a sense of duty or maybe just morbid curiosity. One night, I was sitting at the nurse's station, trying to catch up on paperwork, when Maria came in, her face drawn and pale. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I see it everywhere. In the hallways, in the reflections, even in my dreams. It's like it's following me." I wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, that I'd seen it too, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We'll get through this," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I went back to the basement. I told myself I needed answers, that I couldn't keep living in fear of something I didn't understand. I waited until my shift was almost over, when the hospital was at its quietest, then slipped away from the nurse's station and made my way down the stairs. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sharp and metallic. I moved slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The storage rooms were just as I'd left them, filled with broken equipment and forgotten files. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed something new, a door I'd never seen before, half hidden behind a stack of old mattresses. The door was old, its paint peeling, the handle rusted. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I forced myself to reach out and turn the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, then started down, my footsteps echoing on the concrete steps. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open, papers spilling onto the floor. In the center of the room was a metal table, its surface stained and pitted with age. On the table sat a single object, a small, leather-bound journal. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. I flipped through it, my heart pounding as I read the entries. They were written in a shaky hand, the words growing more frantic with each page. The author, someone named Dr. Harold Finch, described strange occurrences in the hospital. Patients disappearing, staff seeing things that shouldn't exist, a growing sense of dread that seemed to infect everyone who worked there. The final entry was dated nearly 50 years ago. "It's awake," Dr. Finch had written. "We tried to contain it, but it's too strong. If you're reading this, get out. Don't let it find you." I dropped the journal, my hands trembling. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, a weight, a pressure, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I turned, my flashlight beam trembling, but the room was empty. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Maria was gone, her chair empty. The hospital was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. I sat there for a long time, clutching the journal, trying to make sense of what I'd read. The thing in the hospital wasn't new. It had been there for decades, maybe longer. It fed on fear, on pain, on the suffering of the people trapped within its walls. And now, it was awake. After that night, everything changed. The hospital felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed amplified. The squeak of shoes on linoleum, the distant beeping of monitors, the low murmur of voices behind closed doors. I started to notice things I'd missed before, the way the shadows seemed to pool in certain corners, the way the temperature would drop suddenly in the middle of a hallway, the way the lights would flicker just as I passed beneath them. It was as if the hospital was alive, aware, and watching. I tried to talk to the others, to warn them about what I'd found in the basement, but no one wanted to listen. Maria had stopped coming to work altogether. Jamal transferred to another hospital without saying goodbye. Dr. Singh was still there, but he avoided me, his eyes haunted, his hands shaking whenever he thought no one was looking. The rest of the staff kept their heads down, doing their jobs and pretending nothing was wrong. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the way they flinched at every unexpected noise, the way they hurried through their rounds, never lingering in one place for too long. The patients were suffering, too. More and more of them began reporting nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. Some claimed to see things in their rooms, shadows that moved on their own, faces in the windows, hands reaching out from beneath their beds. The doctors prescribed sedatives, but it didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The patients became more agitated, more fearful, their eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. One night, I was called to room 322. The patient, a young woman named Emily, had been admitted for a routine appendectomy. She was supposed to be discharged the next morning, but when I entered her room, I found her sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She was staring at the far corner of the room, her hands clutching the sheets so tightly her knuckles were white. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's in the room with me." I tried to reassure her, telling her that she was safe, that there was nothing there. But she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "It's not human. It's not supposed to be here." I stayed with her until she calmed down, holding her hand and talking to her in a low, soothing voice. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep, but even then, her body remained tense, her breathing shallow and rapid. I sat by her bed, watching the shadows dance on the walls, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing in around us. After my shift ended, I went back to the basement. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could find more answers, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The door to the hidden room was still there, but this time, it was open. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The journal was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper, pinned to the table with a rusted scalpel. The message was written in the same shaky handwriting as before. "It knows you're here." I felt a surge of panic, my heart racing in my chest. I spun around, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing behind me, but the room was empty. I grabbed the note and ran, not stopping until I was back in the brightly lit hallway outside the basement stairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing from the basement, its long, twisted limbs, its empty, black eyes, the way it seemed to move without sound or warning. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the stress and exhaustion were finally catching up with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The thing in the hospital was real, and it was getting stronger. The next few nights were a blur of fear and exhaustion. I started seeing the figure more often, sometimes in the reflection of a window, sometimes at the end of a darkened hallway, sometimes standing just outside the pool of light cast by my flashlight. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I tried to warn the others, but no one wanted to listen. The staff avoided me, whispering behind my back, casting nervous glances in my direction. I started to feel isolated, alone, as if the hospital itself was conspiring to keep me silent. I thought about quitting, about walking away and never looking back, but something kept me there. A sense of responsibility, maybe, or just the stubborn hope that I could find a way to stop whatever was happening. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a noise coming from the old surgical wing. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign at the far end. As I approached, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the hallway, its body twisted and contorted, its eyes fixed on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Then, without warning, it lunged toward me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the hallway, the sound of the thing's pursuit close behind. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, slamming the door shut and pressing my back against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing didn't follow. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the hallway was empty. After that night, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. The hospital was changing, and so was I. I started to see the signs everywhere. The way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist when no one was looking. The way the air grew colder whenever I passed certain rooms. The way the patient's eyes would follow something invisible moving across the ceiling. Even the building itself seemed to groan and sigh, as if it was alive and in pain. I felt like I was walking through a dream, or a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to reach out to the administration, to tell them what was happening, but my emails went unanswered. When I tried to talk to Dr. Singh, he just shook his head and told me to get some rest. "You're working too hard," he said, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he thought I wasn't looking. The rest of the staff avoided me, whispering behind my back, casting nervous glances in my direction. I was alone, and I knew it. The only person who seemed to understand was Emily, the patient from room 322. She was still in the hospital, her discharge delayed by a sudden fever and a series of unexplained complications. I visited her every night, sitting by her bed and listening to her talk about the things she saw in the dark. She told me about the shadowy figure, about the cold hands that reached for her in her dreams, about the voices that whispered to her when the lights went out. "It wants something," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hungry." I asked her what it wanted, but she just shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know," she said, "but it's getting closer." That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that everything was going to be okay. I had to face whatever was haunting the hospital, even if it meant putting myself in danger. I waited until my shift was almost over, then made my way back to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the hidden room was open, the air inside colder than ever. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the room. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing in from all sides. I could hear the whispering again, louder this time, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. In the center of the room stood the figure, its body twisted and contorted, its eyes two black voids that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whispering grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. It was hungry, and it wanted to feed. On fear, on pain, on the suffering of everyone trapped within the hospital's walls. I thought of Emily, of Mrs. Callahan, of all the patients and staff who had suffered because of this thing. I thought of Maria, of Jamal, of Dr. Singh. I thought of myself, of the fear that had taken root in my heart and refused to let go. I realized then that the only way to stop it was to confront it, to refuse to give in to the fear. I took a step forward, my hands shaking. "You can't have us," I said, my voice growing stronger. "We're not yours." The figure recoiled, its body twisting in on itself, the shadows swirling around it like a storm. The whispering grew frantic, desperate, but I stood my ground. I thought of every moment of kindness, every act of courage, every time someone had reached out to help another in the hospital. I focused on those memories, on the light they brought into the darkness. Slowly, the shadows began to recede, the air growing warmer, the whispering fading into silence. The figure shrank, its form dissolving into the darkness until there was nothing left but an empty room. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming in slow, steady gasps, the weight lifting from my chest. When I finally left the basement, the hospital felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The patients slept peacefully, the staff moved with purpose, and the building itself seemed to sigh in relief. Emily was discharged the next day, her fever gone, her eyes bright and clear. Maria returned to work, her old confidence restored. Even Dr. Singh seemed lighter, his hands steady, his eyes free of fear. But I knew the truth. The thing in the hospital wasn't gone. It was just sleeping, waiting for another moment of weakness, another surge of fear to feed on. I knew I would never forget what I had seen, what I had faced. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. The hospital was full of people who cared, who fought for each other, who refused to give in to the darkness. I still work the night shift at St. Augustine's. The building is as old and creaky as ever, the lights still flicker, and the shadows still move in ways they shouldn't. But I'm not afraid anymore. I know what's out there, and I know how to fight it. Not with weapons or prayers, but with hope, with kindness, with the simple act of refusing to let fear win. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. A shadow, a flicker of darkness, a reminder of what still lurks beneath the surface. But I don't run. I stand my ground, and I remember the faces of the people I've helped, the lives I've touched, the light I've brought into the darkness. And I keep going. Because that's what we do. We fight, we endure, we survive. Even when the things we face aren't human.